Archaeologists have begun a major new excavation of the Roman city of Pompeii. It was destroyed nearly 2,000 years ago after Mount Vesuvius erupted.
The mother, cradling her child in the house of the Golden Bracelet, has been a tragic icon since Giuseppe Fiorelli created the plaster casts in the 1860s. For 150 years, guidebooks swore this was a family frozen in the 79 AD eruption. But 2024 DNA research by Gabriele Scorrano shatters that narrative. It turns out the mother was actually a man, and the child was a total stranger from the Eastern Mediterranean. So how did those 19th century excavators turn a handful of bones into this heartfelt family fairy tale? The myth they sold us. When Giuseppe Fiorelli took over the Pompeii excavations in 1860, the city wasn't just a dig site, it was a chaotic graveyard being picked apart by treasure hunters. Fiorelli changed everything by introducing a systematic, scientific approach to the ruins, but in doing so, he accidentally created one of the most enduring pieces of historical fiction in human history. You've likely seen the images, those haunting, ash-colored figures frozen in their final, desperate moments. But what most people don't realize is that these aren't actually bodies. They're plaster shells of the spaces where people once were. As the bodies of the victims decayed over 18 centuries, they left behind hollow voids in the solidified volcanic ash. Fiorelli's genius was in realizing that if you pumped liquid plaster into these pockets, you could recreate the exact shape, clothing, and even the facial expressions of the person at the moment Vesuvius claimed them. It was revolutionary. By the time he finished his tenure in 1875, he'd created over 1,100 of these eternal poses. But here's the thing. While the technique was scientific, the interpretation was pure storytelling. According to research from the Harvard Medical School, the most famous of these discoveries happened in the House of the Golden Bracelet. Archaeologists found a group of 5 skeletons huddled together in what looked like a final, tragic embrace.
As Valeria continues to work on the fragile skeletons, she wants to understand how these people died.
There was an adult holding a small child on their lap, with another adult nearby. Without a second thought, the 19th century excavators labeled them a family. In their minds, it was obvious, a mother and father trying to protect their children as the world ended. Honestly, this wasn't just a simple observation. It was a total projection of Victorian values. Stephen Ellis, a Pompeii expert over at the University of Cincinnati, points out that those early archaeologists were basically swimming in the romanticism of their own era. They were completely obsessed with things like family piety and moral unity. So naturally, when they saw 2 people touching, their brains didn't even go to 2 strangers seeking comfort. Nope, they saw a family. They were desperate to turn Pompeii into a mirror of their own society, a place filled with traditional households and rigid social structures that made sense to them. You have to understand the pressure Fiorelli was under. In the mid-1800s, Italy was struggling to find its identity as a unified nation, and Pompeii was the perfect propaganda tool. According to historical records from the Pompeii Archaeological Park, Fiorelli wasn't just a digger, he was a creator of national heritage. He needed the world to see the Romans as the direct, noble ancestors of the modern Italian family. By labeling a group of bodies as a mother, father, and child, he wasn't just guessing, it was branding. He was making the tragedy relatable to a 19th century audience who valued the nuclear family above all else. But here's where it gets even more calculated. According to excavation logs from the 1860s, Fiorelli's team often cleaned the skeletons before pouring the plaster. If a bone looked like it belonged to a child, but was found near an adult who didn't fit the mother profile. They would sometimes rearrange the debris to make the final cast look more natural or poignant. They weren't just preserving a moment in time, they were directing a scene. They turned a chaotic, messy death into a clean, moralistic statue. This curated death was exactly what the public wanted, and it's the reason these myths stood unchallenged for over 150 years. And get this, the family from the House of the Golden Bracelet didn't just stay in the dirt, it became a global sensation. These casts actually toured museums all over Europe and eventually the rest of the world, acting as these heavy, poignant moral lessons on how fragile life is. Think about it. Millions of people have stood right in front of these displays, feeling this massive, gut-wrenching emotional connection to a mother and her child that, as it turns out, weren't actually a mother and child at all. We've seen them in countless documentaries and history books, always cited as the ultimate proof of the domestic tragedy that unfolded on August 24th and 25th, 79 AD. But as SciTech Daily notes, these poses were interpreted entirely through a cultural lens, not a biological one. Fiorelli's own memoirs even mention the poignant groups he uncovered, showing that he was well aware of the emotional power these casts held. In many cases, excavation logs suggest that the teams knew the skeletal anatomy didn't perfectly align with the labels they were handing out, but the narrative was too good to pass up. They chose the story over the evidence because a family sells more tickets and captures more hearts than 5 unrelated individuals. The problem is that once these labels were set in plaster, they became hard facts in the public consciousness. For 150 years, no one really questioned if the woman with the child was actually a woman, or if the people huddled together even knew each other. We just took the Victorian word for it. It's a classic case of seeing is believing. The physical presence of the cast makes the lie feel undeniable. It makes you wonder about the power of curation. Think back to your own life. What museum display or historical fact did you see as a kid that totally tricked you? Maybe it was a dinosaur pose that turned out to be wrong, or a primitive tool that was actually a ritual object. We trust these institutions to give us the truth, but they're often just giving us the best guess of the person who happened to be holding the shovel that day. In the case of Pompeii, that best guess wasn't just a minor error, it was a total rewrite of the city's social fabric. By forcing these victims into the mold of a nuclear family, archaeologists accidentally erased the true diversity of one of the Roman Empire's busiest port cities. They turned a complex, multicultural hub into a simplified Victorian stage play. But here's where the tragedy of the situation gets even deeper. The very process Fiorelli used to preserve the memory of the victims actually ended up jeopardizing our ability to ever truly know them. The plaster isn't just a shell, it's a chemical contaminant. For decades, it was believed that the gypsum used in the 1860s had effectively destroyed any chance of ever retrieving biological data from the bones trapped inside. They built the myth with plaster and prejudice, creating a version of the past that was comfortable and easy to understand. But cracking that plaster open took a century of science. We had to wait for technology to catch up to our curiosity. How did researchers finally pull DNA from ruins that seemed designed to destroy it? And what did they find when they finally looked past the Victorian lens? Cracking the DNA code. Gabriele Scorrano, a lead researcher from the University of Copenhagen, knew the team was walking into a forensic nightmare when they started drilling into the iconic Pompeii casts in 2024. For over a century, the very thing that made these victims famous, the plaster, had been silently destroying their biological history. When Giuseppe Fiorelli poured that gypsum into the ash voids back in the 1800s, he didn't realize the chemical reaction would essentially cook the remaining bone fragments, eroding the collagen and contaminating almost everything it touched. Most scientists actually thought the data was gone forever, and they weren't entirely wrong, because the team found that nearly 90% of their samples were too degraded to tell us anything. But they found a loophole in the human skeleton. It turns out there is this tiny, dense section of the skull called the petrous bone. It's part of your inner ear, and it is remarkably good at shielding DNA from heat and chemical corruption. According to the study published in Scientific Reports in November 2024, the team managed to extract high-quality genetic material from 14 different individuals by drilling out about 20 grams of bone per sample. It was a painstaking process, especially since the volcanic ashfall originally hit temperatures of 300 degrees Celsius, which literally melted flesh and charred bone long before the plaster even arrived. When the results finally started hitting the monitors, the family narrative didn't just crack, it shattered. Remember that iconic mother from the House of the Golden Bracelet? DNA analysis of the Y chromosomes and mitochondrial DNA proved that this mother was undeniably an adult male, likely between 35 and 40 years old. And the child sitting on his lap, there was zero genetic connection between them. They were two unrelated males who, in their final seconds of life, decided to hold on to each other as the sky fell. The deeper they dug into the genomics, the weirder it got. Another famous group, often described as two sisters or a mother and daughter in a final embrace. According to reports from CBS News, the petrous bone success rate allowed the team to see that many of these family groups were actually just groups of men. There were no biological ties connecting the people we've spent 150 years mourning as a household. We've been looking at these casts through a modern lens of domestic tragedy, but the DNA suggests we're actually looking at the frantic, random intersections of strangers in a city under siege. It makes you stop and think about the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the world. Ever wonder if your own family stories, those legends about where you came from or who your ancestors were, would actually hold up if someone ran the science on them? We've seen how easily a few centuries of storytelling can turn two men in a room into a traditional family just because it felt more poetic to the people holding the pens. And here is where the scope of the discovery really expands. Scorrano told Popular Science that this research rewrites the eruption story because it doesn't just change who these people were to each other, it changes where they were from. By looking at the genetic markers, the researchers found that about 70% of the victims didn't have the local Italian DNA you'd expect from a Roman town. Instead, they saw massive signals from the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and North Africa. One of the men in the Golden Bracelet family had a genetic profile that looked more like someone from modern-day Sardinia or the Near East than a typical Roman citizen. Think about that for a second. We've always been taught that Pompeii was this quintessentially Roman place, but the blood tells a story of a massive, diverse migrant population. This was a cosmopolitan port city where people from all over the known world lived, worked, and eventually died together. The hidden diversity of the Roman Empire was suddenly staring the researchers in the face, proving that the ancient world was just as much of a melting pot as any modern city today. But there is an uncomfortable, undeniable truth hanging over this entire breakthrough. Out of all the people trapped in those plaster shells, only 5 out of the 14 tested yielded enough usable DNA to give us these answers. The rest of them, and the hundreds of other casts sitting in the Pompeii Archaeological Park, might be forever lost to the 1800s idea of preservation. Because Fiorelli wanted to make art out of the tragedy, he inadvertently locked the truth behind a chemical wall that we're only now learning how to scale. We are getting a glimpse into the real Pompeii, but we're doing it through a very narrow, very fragile window. The plaster kept the shape, but it killed the story. Now that we know these people weren't the families we were told they were, it opens up a much bigger mystery. If they weren't locals, and they weren't related, what were they all doing in those houses together? What was the real social hierarchy of a city where a man from the Near East and a stranger's child spent their final moments in an embrace? These weren't families at all. But who were they really? Locals or far-flung traders caught in the wrong place at the wrong time? What does their blood say about Pompeii's true face? And how much more of Roman history is just a cover-up for a much more complicated, diverse reality? Pompeii's hidden diversity. 10 out of the 14 victims analyzed in this 2024 study showed genetic profiles that were anywhere from 40 to 60% Eastern Mediterranean. We're talking about people whose roots trace back to Greece rather than the local Italian countryside. According to reports from SciTech Daily, this autosomal DNA clustering was so dominant that it completely flips the script on what a Roman town actually looked like. For centuries, we've pictured Pompeii as this isolated, quintessential Roman village, but the DNA proves it was actually more like an ancient New York City, a massive trade hub where the world converged. Think about the sheer scale of the movement required to make this happen. Pompeii was a port city of about 11,000 people, and its docks were constantly buzzing with ships bringing in grain, textiles, and slaves from the far reaches of the empire. Stephen Ellis, a Pompeii expert from the University of Cincinnati, explains that we are seeing a level of diversity in the lower classes that historians have traditionally ignored. These victims weren't the pure Roman elites we see in the movies. They were the migrant workforce, the traders, and the formerly enslaved people who actually kept the empire running. If we're being honest, this genetic melting pot shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone who's looked at the economics of the time. According to research from the University of Cincinnati's Pompeii excavations, the city's economy was fueled by the labor of people who were brought there against their will. We're talking about a massive slave trade that moved thousands of people from the eastern frontiers, places like right into the heart of Italy. When the DNA shows Anatolian and Levantine signals, it's literally tracing the path of the Roman Empire's expansion. These victims weren't just visiting traders, they were the backbone of the city. They were the ones baking the bread, hauling the grain from the ships, and maintaining the lavish villas of the elite. As SciTech Daily points out, the fact that these non-local markers were dominant in 70% of the samples suggests that the Roman melting pot wasn't just a metaphor, it was a biological reality. The DNA has effectively stripped away the pure Roman mask that 19th century historians put on the city, showing us that the people who built and lived in Pompeii were far more connected to the East than the West. And this isn't just a one-off discovery. These results actually mirror a 2022 study on victims from nearby Herculaneum, which was also buried under 20 meters of ash. According to Popular Science, that earlier work found similar genetic signatures, suggesting that this wasn't just a Pompeii phenomenon, it was the reality of the entire coastal region. Vesuvius didn't just bury a city, it preserved a snapshot of a massive, globalized society that was far more interconnected than the isolated ancient world we're taught about in school. The uncomfortable truth here is that traditional histories have a habit of erasing migrants. For 150 years, we preferred the story of the Italian family, because it fit a nationalist narrative about Roman heritage. But the science proves that Pompeii thrived specifically because of immigration. The city was a melting pot of languages, religions, and backgrounds, all living side by side until the mountain literally collapsed on top of them. Here is where it gets truly interesting. When you look at the victims from the House of the Golden Bracelet again, knowing they were unrelated men from the Eastern Mediterranean, the scene changes from a family tragedy to a story of shared humanity among strangers. Maybe they were workers in the same shop, or travelers who met at the docks and fled to the same house for cover. It makes the disaster feel less like a closed-off historical event and more like a modern crisis where people from all walks of life are suddenly thrown together by circumstances they can't control. That's the new Pompeii. It's a place that was built by the hands of people from Anatolia and North Africa, managed by Roman law, and eventually frozen in a way that tricked us for over a century. But with truths this big finally coming to light, you have to wonder what else we've gotten wrong. What other facts are sitting in museums right now, just waiting for a drill bit and a DNA sequencer to prove they're actually just fairy tales? We're finally starting to see the real faces of the ancient world, and they look a lot more like the world we live in today than we ever dared to imagine. For over a century, we mourned a fiction, while the real stories of these people waited silently in their bones. The DNA shatters those 19th century family tales, proving the victims were often unrelated strangers from across the globe. As Harvard Medical School points out, this completely challenges the stories we've told ourselves about Pompeii. With digs continuing through 2025 and beyond, history is still being rewritten. What history lie should DNA bust next? Drop your thoughts below. Which myth hits you hardest?